There are nights when sleep feels like a foreign concept, when you lie there listening to the rhythm of someone else's breathing and wonder how two people can share a bed and still feel so impossibly alone. This was one of those nights. Clara slept beside me, her back turned toward the window, her body curved away from mine like a question mark I had never learned to answer. The space between us felt measured in miles rather than inches. I stared at the ceiling, counting the familiar cracks in the plaster that I had memorized over years of sleepless nights. The house was quiet in that particular way that suburban homes get quiet after midnight, when even the refrigerator stops humming and the only sound is the distant whisper of cars on the highway, carrying people to places I would never know. My phone buzzed against the nightstand. The screen lit up, casting a pale blue rectangle across the dark room. I almost ignored it. At 36, I had learned that messages received after midnight were rarely worth the disruption they caused to whatever fragile peace you had managed to construct. But something made me reach for it anyway, maybe the same restless energy that had been keeping me awake for weeks. The notification showed a name I hadn't seen in years. Damian. Just seeing those 6 letters on the screen made something inside my chest shift, like a door being opened in a house I thought I had sealed shut. The message was brief, almost casual in its devastation. Do you ever think about that night? I didn't need to ask which night he meant. There was only one night that mattered, one night that had been quietly reshaping every day since it happened. I was 19 then, living in a cramped dorm room that smelled like instant coffee and the peculiar mustiness that comes from too many young men living in too small a space. Damian had been my roommate, assigned by some algorithm that matched us based on our major and sleep schedule, as if those simple data points could predict the way 2 lives might intertwine. That night, we had been studying for different exams, the room filled with the comfortable silence that comes when you know someone well enough to exist in the same space without needing to fill every moment with words. I was lying on my narrow bed, textbook propped against my knees, when he looked up from his desk and said something that changed everything. I wonder how you would hold me, just if I ever needed it. He said it quietly, almost to himself, as if he were testing how the words sounded in the air between us. I had frozen, my highlighter suspended above a paragraph about Victorian literature that suddenly seemed completely irrelevant. The question hung there, heavy with possibility and terror. We were just boys then, fumbling our way through a world that had given us no language for what we were feeling, no roadmap for navigating the territory between friendship and something deeper. I should have said something. I should have put down my book and shown him exactly how I would hold him, should have crossed that impossible distance between his desk and my bed and changed both of our lives forever. Instead, I had pretended to be absorbed in my studying, let the moment pass like a train I was too afraid to board. He turned back to his books, and we never spoke of it again. By the end of that semester, he had transferred to another school, chasing some opportunity or maybe just running from the weight of unspoken words. Now, 18 years later, I was staring at his message in the dark, feeling that same paralysis creep through my limbs. Clara stirred beside me, and I quickly dimmed the screen, but I didn't close the message. I couldn't. Instead, I lay there in the darkness, remembering the sound of his voice when he asked that question, the way the lamplight had caught the side of his face, the terrible gentleness in his eyes. The phone felt heavy in my hands, like it was holding more than circuits and glass. It was holding years of what-ifs, decades of carefully buried longing, the weight of a life that had been built on the foundation of that one moment when I chose safety over truth. I thought about Clara, about our children sleeping in their rooms down the hall, about the careful architecture of respectability we had constructed together. But I also thought about the hollow feeling that had been growing inside me, the sense that I was living someone else's life, following someone else's script. I had become good at it, this performance of contentment, but lying there in the dark with Damian's message glowing on my phone, I felt the mask slipping. I closed the message without responding, but I didn't delete it. I placed the phone face down on the nightstand and turned to look at Clara's sleeping form, at the familiar curve of her shoulder beneath the thin fabric of her nightgown. She was a good person, had always been a good person, and she deserved better than the half-life I had been giving her, the careful affection that felt more like gratitude than love. The story of my life, I realized, had begun not with any grand gesture or dramatic moment, but here, in this quiet bedroom, in the space between a message received and a message unanswered. It had begun in stillness, in the slow recognition that the life I had been living was not quite the life I was meant to live, and that somewhere in the distance between then and now, I had lost something essential, something that might still be possible to reclaim. Morning came the way it always did in our house, with the careful choreography of a family that had learned to move around each other without collision. I woke before the alarm, as I had for years, and lay there listening to Clara's breathing settle into the lighter rhythm of approaching consciousness. The message from Damian felt like something I had dreamed, but when I reached for my phone, there it was, still waiting. I slipped out of bed and into the shower, letting the hot water wash away the residue of sleeplessness. By the time I emerged, Clara was already downstairs, moving through the kitchen with the efficient grace of someone who had long ago stopped expecting help with the morning routine. She had coffee ready, lunches packed, and was braiding our daughter Emma's hair while simultaneously checking that our son Michael had remembered his science project. This was our life. Coordinated, functional, quietly beautiful in its orderliness. Our house in upstate New York sat on a tree-lined street where neighbors waved from their driveways and dogs walked themselves in invisible yards bounded by good intentions rather than fences. The walls inside were painted in colors Clara had chosen from magazines, soft grays and warm whites that created an atmosphere of tasteful calm. I taught English at the local high school, had been teaching there for 8 years, long enough to become part of the furniture, trusted with advanced placement classes, and the drama club that met after hours in the auditorium that smelled of old wood and teenage ambition. My students knew me as Mr. Whitaker, the teacher who assigned poetry they actually wanted to read, who never raised his voice, who remembered their names long after they graduated. Every morning, I kissed Clara goodbye on the cheek, a gesture that had become as automatic as checking the locks. She would lean into it slightly, but there was a quality to the touch that reminded me of the way siblings show affection, dutiful and fond, but somehow hollow at the center. She never complained, never asked for more, which somehow made it worse. I drove to work along familiar roads, past the coffee shop where I sometimes stopped for a better cup than what we made at home, past the bookstore that was always threatening to close but somehow never did, past the small park where Clara sometimes took the children on weekends when I was grading papers or pretending to grade papers while actually staring out the window at nothing in particular. At school, I found comfort in routine. First period Shakespeare, second period creative writing, third period prep time that I spent organizing books by author and copyright date, a habit that my colleagues found amusing and slightly obsessive. There was something soothing about the alphabetical certainty of it, the way Austen always came before Dickens, the way the world could be made orderly if you just knew the right system. Lunch was usually spent alone in my classroom, eating the sandwich Clara had packed, reading whatever novel I was working through that month. I read constantly, voraciously, as if the right book might contain the answer to questions I had never learned to ask out loud. My colleagues sometimes invited me to join them in the faculty lounge, but I preferred the quiet of my own space, the familiar weight of words on a page. The emptiness was hardest to name because there was nothing obviously wrong with any of it. Clara was a good mother, a thoughtful partner, someone who remembered birthdays and scheduled dentist appointments and never let the milk run out. The children were healthy and bright, quick to laugh and slow to anger. Max, our golden retriever, greeted me every evening as if I were returning from war rather than a day of teaching teenagers about metaphor and theme. Evenings followed their own gentle pattern. Dinner together, homework supervision, baths, and bedtime stories. Then Clara and I would settle into our respective corners of the living room, she with her laptop catching up on emails or planning the next day's tasks, me with a book and the television murmuring quietly in the background. We rarely fought because there was rarely anything to fight about. We had built a life that ran smoothly, like a well-maintained machine, and sometimes I wondered if that was the problem. I spent a lot of time on the front porch after dark, reading under the yellow glow of the porch light until my eyes grew tired, listening to the sounds of the neighborhood settling into sleep. Sometimes Clara would bring me a beer or a cup of tea, would sit beside me for a few minutes without saying anything, and in those moments I could almost convince myself that this quiet contentment was enough. But then I would remember the weight of possibility, the sense I had carried since college that there was some other version of myself I had never met, some other life I had never tried on. The feeling would pass, usually buried under the practical demands of daily life, but it never disappeared completely. It was during a faculty meeting in late September that someone mentioned the reunion. Janet from the math department was talking about her own high school reunion, how strange it had been to see everyone 20 years older, how the popular kids had gotten fat and the outcasts had become successful. The conversation drifted to college reunions, and someone asked if I was planning to attend mine. I shook my head automatically. I never attended reunions, had no interest in performing nostalgia with people I barely remembered. But the question stayed with me as I walked back to my classroom, echoing in a way that felt disproportionate to its importance. Later, alone in my classroom during prep period, I found myself opening Facebook for the first time in months. I told myself I was just curious, just checking to see if anyone from college was still alive and posting pictures of their children. But my fingers seemed to move on their own, typing his name into the search bar. There he was, Damian Reynolds. The profile picture showed him older, lines around his eyes that made him look both more serious and more gentle than the boy I remembered. He was still performing, it seemed, still carrying a guitar from city to city like a talisman against ordinary life. No wife visible in his photos, no children, just stages and empty hotel rooms and sunsets from places I would never see. And there, in the events section of his profile, was the thing that made my chest tighten: RSVP'd to our college reunion. Going. I closed the laptop quickly, as if someone might walk in and see what I was looking at. But the image of his face stayed with me for the rest of the day, for the drive home, for dinner with my family, for the quiet evening hours when I should have been grading papers, but instead found myself staring out at the darkening street, wondering what it would feel like to see him again after all these years, wondering if he ever thought about that night, about the question he had asked that I had never answered. 2 days passed before the notification appeared on my phone. I was in my classroom, grading essays about symbolism in The Great Gatsby, when the small blue bubble popped up on my screen. Friend request from Damian Reynolds. My hand stopped moving across the paper, red pen hovering over a particularly confused paragraph about the green light, and I stared at his name as if it might disappear if I looked away. I waited until I got home to respond. There's something about accepting a friend request that feels like opening a door, and I wanted to be alone when I did it. Wanted to control the environment where this small act of reconnection took place. After dinner, after helping Emma with her math homework and listening to Michael read aloud from his chapter book, after Clara had settled into her evening routine of organizing the next day's chaos, I climbed the stairs to our bedroom and closed the door. The friend request was still there, waiting with digital patience. I clicked accept before I could change my mind, and immediately his profile opened before me like a window into a life I had never lived. The photos were a catalog of movement, of stages and hotel rooms and cities I recognized from movies but had never visited. He looked older, of course, but in a way that seemed intentional, as if he had chosen which parts of youth to keep and which to let go. His eyes were the same, though. In every picture, whether he was holding a guitar or standing in front of some landmark or caught laughing with people I didn't recognize, his eyes held that same quality they had possessed in college, a kind of reckless curiosity about the world that made ordinary things seem possible and impossible things seem inevitable. But there was something else there now, a gravity that hadn't existed when we were 19, as if the years had taught him something about loss that showed in the way he looked at cameras. There was no wife in any of the pictures, no children, no evidence of the settled domestic life that had claimed most of our classmates. Instead, there were instrument cases and empty highways, coffee cups in cities I would never visit, sunsets from places that existed for him, but not for me. He was still performing, still carrying music from place to place like a missionary of something I had never learned to name. I scrolled through months of posts, each one a small glimpse into a life lived without the careful boundaries I had constructed around my own existence. Here he was in Nashville, playing at some small venue with exposed brick walls and mismatched chairs. Here in Portland, standing in front of a bookstore that looked like the kind of place where poets gathered to read their work to audiences of 12 people who understood something about longing that couldn't be taught in schools. The message came while I was still scrolling, still trying to piece together the shape of his life from these digital fragments. The notification made me jump, as if he had somehow known I was looking, as if the act of witnessing his life from a distance had summoned his attention back to me. "Are you too good to see me again?" The words appeared on my screen with a casualness that belied their weight. It was such a Damian thing to say, teasing and direct at the same time, cutting through whatever careful politeness I might have tried to construct around our reconnection. I stared at the message for a long time, reading it over and over as if the words might change their meaning through repetition. Clara was moving around downstairs, getting the house ready for another day, and I could hear the familiar sounds of her evening routine, the way she always checked the locks twice and turned off lights in a specific order that she had never explained but never varied. My marriage to Clara had been built on gentleness, on shared values and compatible goals, and the kind of steady affection that made for stable homes and well-adjusted children. We had met at a faculty mixer when I was new to teaching, and she was working as a school counselor in the district. She was kind and intelligent and wanted the same things I thought I wanted: a house and children and the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived. I had proposed because it seemed like the logical next step, because she deserved to be asked, and because I couldn't think of any good reason not to marry her. Our wedding was small and lovely, filled with people who approved of our match, who saw in us the promise of the kind of partnership that made community stronger. And for years, that had been enough, or I had convinced myself it was enough. But now, staring at Damian's message, I felt something shift inside my chest, some long-buried recognition that the life I had built, however good and stable and respectable, was not quite the life I was supposed to be living. Clara sensed it before I did, the way she always seemed to sense changes in the emotional weather of our house before they became visible to anyone else. She asked me that night if everything was all right, standing in the bathroom doorway while I brushed my teeth, and I could see in her reflection in the mirror that she knew something had changed, even if she couldn't name what it was. I told her I was fine, just tired, and she nodded in the way she always did when she decided not to push, when she chose to give me space rather than demand explanations I wasn't ready to give. Later, after she had fallen asleep, after the house had settled into its familiar nighttime quiet, I picked up my phone and typed a response. My fingers moved slowly, choosing each word with the care of someone defusing a bomb, knowing that what I wrote next would change something fundamental about the direction of my life. "You said something to me once, about how I would hold you." I never answered. I sent it before I could reconsider, before I could think too carefully about what I was doing or what it might mean. The response came so quickly that I wondered if he had been sitting somewhere, waiting, watching his phone with the same nervous attention I had been giving mine. "You still can." 3 words that reordered everything. I read them again, then closed the phone and set it on the nightstand. But I could feel them glowing there in the darkness, could feel them changing the shape of the air in the room. The reunion was a week away, and suddenly I knew I would be going. Knew it with the same certainty I had known 18 years ago that I wouldn't. The next morning, over coffee and the usual breakfast chaos of backpacks and permission slips and forgotten homework, I told Clara I was thinking about going to the reunion after all. She looked up from Emma's lunchbox, surprised but not suspicious, and said that sounded like fun, that it might be good for me to see old friends again. I would need to stay overnight, I said, since it was being held at a lodge outside town and would run late. She nodded, already calculating the logistics of a weekend alone with the children, already adjusting her own plans to accommodate this sudden change in our routine. She was good at that, had always been good at adapting to the unexpected demands of family life. I didn't mention Damian's name. I told myself it was because there was nothing specific to mention, because I didn't know what would happen when I saw him again, if anything would happen at all. But I knew I was lying to myself, knew that I was already planning something I didn't have words for yet, something that felt both inevitable and impossible. That night, lying in bed beside Clara, I thought about the boy I had been in that cramped dorm room, the boy who had been too afraid to cross the space between his bed and Damian's desk, too frightened of his own desires to reach for what he wanted most. I thought about the man I had become, careful and responsible, and quietly disappearing into the comfortable prison of a life that looked perfect from the outside. And I thought about Damian's message, those 3 words that had opened a door I thought I had sealed forever. You still can. As if 18 years of careful living could be undone by the simple act of finally answering a question that had been waiting all this time for me to find the courage to speak. The drive to the reunion felt like traveling backward through time, each familiar landmark pulling me deeper into a version of myself I had spent 18 years trying to forget. The lodge sat nestled against a lake that reflected the late afternoon sky like a mirror someone had forgotten to clean, surrounded by the kind of pine trees that made everything smell like childhood and possibility. I arrived later than I had planned, my nerves having gotten the better of me twice, forcing me to pull over at rest stops where I sat in my car and wondered what I was doing, why I was driving towards something that felt both necessary and terrifying. By the time I finally parked and walked toward the main building, I could hear laughter and conversation spilling out through the open doors, the particular sound that groups of middle-aged people make when they're trying to pretend they are still young. The main hall was exactly what you would expect from a college reunion, decorated with photos from our graduation year and name tags that featured pictures of who we used to be next to who we had become. I picked up my tag and stared at the photo they had used, a formal portrait from the yearbook where I looked impossibly young and earnest, my hair longer than I had worn it since, my eyes holding a kind of openness that I wasn't sure I possessed anymore. I scanned the room, telling myself I was just getting oriented, just trying to recognize faces from 2 decades ago, but I knew I was looking for him. The space was filled with people I half remembered, former classmates who had aged into successful versions of their younger selves, carrying pictures of spouses and children, talking about careers and mortgages and the comfortable weight of lives fully inhabited. And then I saw him. He was standing near the far wall, laughing at something someone had said, his head tilted back in that way I remembered from college, as if laughter was something he gave freely, without calculating its cost. He looked different and exactly the same, his hair longer than most of the men in the room, his clothes suggesting someone who had never fully committed to looking respectable. But it was his hands I noticed first, still graceful in the way that had always made me think of musicians or priests, people whose work required a different kind of precision. Our eyes met across the room, and for a moment everything else disappeared. The conversation, the laughter, the careful performance of reunion joy, all of it faded into background noise. He smiled, a slow smile that reached his eyes, and raised his hand in a small wave that somehow contained everything we had never said to each other. I made my way through the crowd, accepting handshakes and brief conversations with people whose names I struggled to remember, but all of it felt like moving underwater. Every interaction filtered through the awareness of where I was going and who was waiting for me there. By the time I reached him, my heart was beating so hard I was certain he could hear it. We started carefully, the way people do when they are testing the ground beneath their feet. "How are you? It's been so long. You look good." The usual pleasantries that serve as a bridge between who you used to be with someone and who you are now. He introduced me to the small group he had been talking with, people I vaguely remembered from various classes, and I found myself falling into the rhythm of reunion conversation, sharing the acceptable details of my life, my work, my family. But even as we talked with the others, I was aware of him watching me, of the way his attention felt different from everyone else's, more focused, more knowing. When someone asked about my wife, I mentioned Clara with the practiced ease of someone who had learned to discuss his marriage without revealing its emptiness, and I saw something flicker across his face, too quick to interpret, but impossible to miss. As the evening wore on, the crowd began to thin, people drifting back to their hotel rooms or into smaller groups for more intimate conversations. Damian and I found ourselves alone more often, the careful politeness of our initial exchanges giving way to something more familiar, as if we were remembering how to talk to each other, remembering the particular frequency on which our friendship had once operated. He told me about his life on the road, about the small venues and late nights and the particular loneliness that comes from always being in motion. I told him about teaching, about the satisfaction of watching teenagers discover that poetry could matter, about the quiet rhythms of suburban life that had become both comfort and cage. We talked around the edges of deeper things, each of us testing how much truth the other was prepared to hear. It was after midnight when he suggested we go outside. The lodge had a series of benches scattered around the grounds, positioned to take advantage of the lake view, and we found one that faced the water, far enough from the building that the sounds of the reunion became just a distant murmur. The night was clear and cold, the kind of autumn evening that makes you aware of your own breathing, and I could smell wood smoke from somewhere nearby, someone's fireplace, or maybe a campfire hidden among the trees. We sat without talking for a while, both of us looking out at the lake where moonlight created a path across the water that seemed to lead somewhere we couldn't name. There was something about the darkness that made conversation easier, as if the things we had never said to each other required the cover of night to finally emerge. He spoke first, his voice quieter than it had been inside, more careful. He said he had never understood what that moment in college had meant to him, the night when he had asked how I would hold him. He said it had haunted him, not in a bad way, but like a song you can't quite remember all the words to, something beautiful that stays just out of reach. I listened without interrupting, feeling something inside my chest begin to loosen, some knot of tension I had been carrying for so long I had forgotten it was there. When he finished talking, I found myself saying something I hadn't planned to say, something I wasn't sure I had ever admitted even to myself. I think I loved you. The words came out simply, without drama or ceremony, just a statement of fact that had been waiting 18 years to be spoken. He turned to look at me then, and in the moonlight I could see something in his expression that looked like relief. I know, he said, and somehow those two words contained more understanding than all the careful conversations I had ever had with Clara, more recognition than I had found in 18 years of marriage and family life, and the daily performance of being someone I wasn't sure I actually was. We sat in that acknowledgement for a long time, not touching, not moving closer, just existing in the space of finally having said what we should have said when we were boys who didn't know any better. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the opposite, the kind of quiet that comes when people finally stop pretending to be someone they're not. Then he asked, so softly I almost didn't hear him, "Can I see how you would have held me?" The question hung in the air between us, simple and impossible, a request that somehow contained everything we had lost and everything we might still find. I didn't answer with words. Instead, I turned toward him and opened my arms, and he moved into them as if he had always belonged there, as if the 18 years of separation had been just a pause in a conversation we were finally ready to finish. It wasn't passionate or desperate, or any of the ways I had imagined it might be during the long nights when I had allowed myself to think about what it would feel like to touch him. It was gentler than that, more necessary. He folded into my embrace like someone coming home after a long journey, his head against my shoulder, his breathing gradually slowing to match mine. We stayed like that until the sky began to lighten, until the first birds began to call from the trees around the lake, until the night that had made this possible began to give way to a day that would require us to decide what any of it meant. But for those hours, sitting on a bench beside a lake whose name I didn't know, holding the man I had loved since I was 19 years old, I felt something I had never felt before. The weight of being exactly who I was supposed to be, exactly where I was supposed to be, for the first time in my adult life. I drove home through the early morning light with something fundamental changed inside me, though I couldn't have explained what that something was to anyone who asked. The reunion had ended with handshakes and promises to stay in touch that most people would never keep, but Damian and I had said goodbye differently, with a look that held everything we couldn't say in a room full of people who wouldn't understand. Clara was in the kitchen when I walked through the door, already dressed for the day, making pancakes for the children who were still upstairs in various stages of waking up. She looked up when I entered, and I saw her take in my appearance, the wrinkled clothes, and the something different in my face that I wasn't sure I was ready to explain. "Did you have a good time?" she asked, and I told her yes, better than I expected, which was both true and completely insufficient. She nodded and returned to the pancakes, but I caught her watching me throughout the morning, the way she watched the children when they were coming down with something, alert to changes she couldn't yet name. The thing was, I hadn't done anything wrong, not in any way that could be measured or judged. I had attended a reunion, talked with old classmates, shared a bench with someone I used to know. I had held him, yes, but it was just comfort, just the fulfillment of a promise made 18 years too late. No one had removed any clothing. No one had kissed anyone. No one had violated any vows or crossed any lines that society had drawn around acceptable behavior. But everything had changed anyway. I moved through the next few days like someone learning to walk in a body that no longer quite fit. I was quieter than usual, more present in conversations with the children, more patient with the small frustrations that typically scattered through my days. Clara noticed. I could tell, but she didn't ask, and I found myself grateful for her restraint, for the way she had always given me space to work through whatever was troubling me without demanding immediate explanations. At school, my students commented that I seemed different, more relaxed somehow, and I found myself teaching with a kind of energy I hadn't felt in years. When we discussed poetry, I heard myself talking about longing and desire with a new understanding, as if someone had handed me a translation key to emotions I had always known existed but never learned to read. It was 3 days after the reunion when I sat down at my desk in the den and wrote the letter I knew I would never send. Clara was upstairs giving the children their baths, and the house was filled with the sounds of family life continuing its familiar patterns, but I felt separate from it all, as if I were watching our life from behind glass. The letter began simply. "I wanted to tell you what it felt like to hold you," I wrote, because I don't think I was able to say it properly when we were sitting by the lake. It felt like remembering something I had forgotten, like coming home to a place I didn't know I had been missing. I wrote about the weight of him against my chest, how natural it had felt despite all the years of distance between us. I wrote about the way his breathing had slowed to match mine, how we had sat there until dawn without needing to fill the silence with explanations or promises or plans for what might come next. I wrote about how terrifying it had been to feel so completely myself, to inhabit my own skin without apology or pretense for the first time in longer than I could remember. The letter grew longer as I wrote, becoming something between confession and prayer, an attempt to capture in words what had happened to me in those hours beside the lake. I wrote about the 18 years of careful living, about the way I had built a life that looked perfect from the outside but felt hollow at the center. I wrote about Clara and the children and how much I loved them, but also about the growing awareness that love could take different forms, that the love I felt for my family was real and good, and also somehow not enough to fill the space inside me that had been empty for so long. When I finished, I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the bottom drawer of my desk, beneath old tax returns and warranties for appliances we no longer owned. I told myself I was keeping it because I might want to read it again someday, might need to remember what this moment felt like when the clarity faded and I returned to the comfortable numbness of routine. For 2 weeks, the letter stayed hidden, and I began to think that maybe I could contain what had happened at the reunion, could file it away as a meaningful moment that didn't need to change anything about the structure of my daily life. I went to work, helped with homework, attended parent-teacher conferences, and mowed the lawn on Saturday mornings like I always had. Clara and I maintained our polite distance, our careful choreography of a marriage that functioned smoothly without requiring too much emotional investment from either of us. But Clara had always been more observant than I gave her credit for. She had been watching me, I realized later, the way she watched everything in our house, with the quiet attention of someone who had made it her job to notice when things were out of place. So when she was looking for the receipt for Emma's piano lessons, and she opened the bottom drawer of my desk, and she found the letter I had written to someone else, someone whose name she recognized from conversations we had had years ago about college friends, she didn't panic or assume the worst. She read it. Sitting in the chair where I graded papers and paid bills and pretended to organize the practical details of our life together, she read every word I had written about holding another man, about feeling whole for the first time, about the 18 years of careful performance that our marriage had required from me. When I came home from work that evening, I found her in the kitchen, standing at the counter with the letter spread open beside her. She looked up when I walked in, and I saw in her face something I had never seen before, a kind of terrible understanding, as if she were finally seeing clearly something she had always known but never allowed herself to acknowledge. "Is it real?" she asked, her voice so quiet I almost didn't hear her. I could have lied. I could have explained it away, could have minimized what had happened, could have turned the letter into something less than what it was. For 18 years, I had been so careful to protect her from the truth about who I was, to maintain the fiction that our marriage was built on something more solid than mutual convenience and the shared desire to live a respectable life. But standing there in our kitchen, looking at her face, I realized that the kindest thing I could do was finally tell her the truth. I nodded just once, but it was enough. Her face crumpled then, not with anger or betrayal, but with a recognition that seemed to have been building for years. "I always knew you were somewhere else," she whispered, and in those words I heard the accumulated weight of all the times she had tried to reach me and found me absent, all the moments when she had sensed the distance between us but chosen not to name it. That night, after we had talked until there were no more words, after she had cried quietly while I sat helpless beside her, after we had both acknowledged that our marriage had been built on foundations that were never as solid as we had pretended, I stood in the bathroom looking at myself in the mirror. For the first time in my adult life, I saw a man I did not entirely hate. Not because I knew who I was, exactly, or because I had any clear sense of what came next, but because I was finally willing to learn, finally ready to stop running from the parts of myself I had spent so many years trying to ignore. The face looking back at me was older than the boy in the dorm room who had been too afraid to answer when someone asked how he would hold him, but it was also somehow younger, as if honesty had stripped away years of careful pretense. I didn't know what would happen next, what this new willingness to see myself clearly would cost, or where it would lead. But for the first time since I was 19 years old, I felt like I was moving toward something rather than running away from it. The weeks that followed our conversation moved with a different rhythm, as if the house itself had exhaled something it had been holding for too long. Clara and I existed in the same spaces, but with new awareness, like people who had finally named the ghost that had been living in their walls. There was grief in it, the slow recognition that something we had built together was ending. But there was also relief, the particular lightness that comes from no longer having to pretend. She was gentler with me than I deserved, kinder than I had any right to expect. In the mornings, she still made coffee for both of us, still asked about my day, still moved through our shared routines with the same careful attention to detail. But now there was space between us that felt clean rather than hollow, distance that acknowledged what was true rather than trying to bridge what had never really been connected. The children sensed the change without understanding it, the way children always do. Emma asked why Mommy and Daddy seemed different, why we talked more quietly than we used to, why the air in the house felt somehow lighter. I told her that sometimes grown-ups needed to figure things out, and that figuring things out could be sad and good at the same time. She nodded as if this made perfect sense, which maybe it did, to someone who hadn't yet learned that life was supposed to be simpler than it actually was. At school, I found myself teaching differently, talking about the characters in the books we read as if they were real people making real choices rather than fictional constructs designed to illustrate literary themes. When we discussed Robert Frost and his roads diverging in a yellow wood, I heard myself talking about the weight of decisions, the way choosing one path meant forever wondering about the other, with an authority that came from standing at my own crossroads. It was on a Thursday evening in late October when Clara found me on the porch, reading under the yellow light that had become my sanctuary during the long process of figuring out who I was becoming. She sat down beside me without saying anything, and we watched the street in comfortable silence, the way we had done so many times before, but with different meaning now. "Whatever you choose," she said finally, her voice carrying the particular gentleness she used when talking to the children about difficult things, "don't let it be out of guilt. Not for me. Not for the kids." I looked at her then, this woman who had shared my life for so many years, who had built a family with me and trusted me with her own dreams, and I saw in her face something I had missed for too long. She had her own ghosts, her own unlived possibilities, her own version of the question Damian had asked me 18 years ago. Our marriage had been built on mutual settling, on the shared willingness to choose safety over the terrifying uncertainty of actually being ourselves. She deserved better than that. We both did. 2 days later, I drove to the city. I hadn't told Damian I was coming, hadn't made plans or announcements. I simply looked up the venue where he was playing that weekend, called in sick to work on Friday afternoon, and drove south on highways that felt like they were leading me towards some version of myself I had never had the courage to meet. The bar was smaller than I had imagined, one of those places that exists in the spaces between neighborhoods, where people gather to hear music that won't make them rich or famous, but might make them feel less alone. The walls were brick-painted black, and mismatched chairs surrounded small tables that had been scarred by years of drinks and conversations, and the particular intimacy that comes from listening to someone tell their truth through song. I arrived early and found a table near the back, ordered a beer I didn't really want, and waited. The opening act was a woman with a guitar and a voice like whiskey, singing songs about leaving places that had never felt like home. I listened without really hearing, my attention focused on the stage where Damian would soon appear, on the moment when our eyes would meet across a room, and we would both have to decide what that meant. When he walked onto the small stage, carrying his guitar like a familiar friend, I felt something settle inside my chest, some piece of myself clicking into place. He looked older under the stage lights, more serious than he had at the reunion, but when he began to play, I heard in his music the same restless longing that had drawn me to him when we were boys who didn't yet know what they wanted from the world. He played for an hour, songs I didn't recognize, but that felt like they had been written for me, about distance and homecoming and the particular courage required to stop running from yourself. Halfway through the set, during a song about highways and the people we leave behind, his eyes found mine across the room. He didn't stop playing, didn't acknowledge me with anything more than a brief nod, but I felt the recognition pass between us like an electric current. After the set, after the small audience had applauded and drifted back to their conversations, he made his way through the tables to where I was sitting. He didn't seem surprised to see me, as if he had been expecting me to appear, as if my presence in his life had become inevitable rather than accidental. We didn't talk in the bar, just gathered his guitar and walked outside into the cool October night. The city was quieter than I had expected, the streets wide enough for comfortable silence. We walked without destination, past closed storefronts and late-night restaurants, past people living lives I would never understand, until we found ourselves in a small park where streetlights created pools of yellow warmth in the darkness. He didn't ask me what I was doing there, didn't demand explanations or promises or clarity about what came next. He simply waited, the way he had always waited, for me to find the words for what I was feeling. "I can't promise you forever," I said finally, the words coming out more easily than I had expected. "But I want to know what it's like to be whole, even if it's just for 1 year. 1 season." It wasn't a declaration of love, wasn't a commitment to any particular future. It was something smaller and more honest, an acknowledgement that I was tired of living at half capacity, tired of measuring my desires against other people's expectations. It was a request for permission to finally answer the question he had asked when we were 19, to discover what it might feel like to hold him not just once, but regularly, without apology or explanation. He looked at me for a long time, and I saw in his face the same recognition I had felt at the reunion, the understanding that some things don't need to be defined to be real. Then he reached out and took my hand, his fingers warm against mine, and we stood there under a streetlight in a city that didn't know either of our names, finally connected in the way we should have been 18 years ago. We didn't talk about logistics or practicalities, didn't make plans or set boundaries. We simply walked, hand in hand, through streets that suddenly felt like they belonged to us, under a quiet sky that held space for whatever we were becoming. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like I was moving towards something rather than away from it, like I was choosing my life rather than simply accepting what had been chosen for me. When I returned home from the city, I moved my clothes into the guest room without ceremony or explanation. Clara watched from the doorway as I transferred shirts and books and the small personal items that accumulate in the spaces where we sleep, and she nodded as if she had been expecting this, as if we were finally acknowledging what had been true for longer than either of us wanted to admit. The children adjusted to the change with the resilience that children possess for the incomprehensible shifts in adult behavior. I told them, in slow and careful words, that sometimes people who love each other realize they love each other differently than they thought they did, and that different kinds of love sometimes mean living in different ways. Emma asked if we were getting divorced, and I told her we were learning how to be a family that looked different from other families, but still took care of each other. Michael, who was younger and more concerned with immediate practicalities, asked if this meant he wouldn't get help with his math homework anymore. I assured him that some things would never change, and that evening I sat with him at the kitchen table, working through fractions while Clara prepared dinner and the house settled into its new rhythm. The guest room became a space of possibility rather than exile. I brought in better lamps for reading, hung pictures I had never gotten around to putting up elsewhere, created a corner where I could grade papers without feeling like I was hiding from my own family. Clara began to reclaim spaces too, turning the small room next to our bedroom into a studio where she could paint again, something she had abandoned when the children were small and had never quite found her way back to. I would hear her up there in the evenings, moving around, and sometimes catch glimpses of canvases covered with colors I didn't recognize from our shared life, landscapes and abstracts that seemed to come from someplace inside her that had been waiting years to emerge. We were both becoming strangers to each other, but strangers in the best possible way, people finally willing to discover who we actually were beneath the roles we had been playing. At school, my teaching took on a different quality, as if honesty in one part of my life had unlocked honesty in all the others. I found myself assigning poems I had always loved but never quite known how to discuss, works that dealt with longing and identity and the particular courage required to live authentically in a world that rewarded conformity. One afternoon in November, I read my students a poem by Jack Gilbert about desire, not the explosive kind that movies and songs celebrate, but the quiet kind that sits in the body like a missed train, like a letter that was never sent. As I read the final lines aloud, my voice caught slightly, and I had to pause, overcome by the recognition of my own story in someone else's words. One of my students, a girl who always sat in the front row and took notes in different colored pens, asked if I was all right. I told her that sometimes poetry hits you in places you didn't know were tender, and she nodded as if this made perfect sense, which maybe it did. That evening, I drove to the city again, but this time it felt different. Not desperate or secretive, but intentional, like someone keeping an appointment with his own life. I didn't call ahead, but when I arrived at Damian's apartment, he opened the door as if he had been expecting me, as if my presence in his life had become a regularity rather than a surprise. We spent the evening talking and listening to music, and later we walked through his neighborhood, past late-night cafes and bookstores that stayed open until midnight, past people living lives that seemed both foreign and familiar. When he took my hand, it felt natural rather than revolutionary, like something we had always done but had simply forgotten for a while. I told him about the guest room, about the conversations with the children, about Clara's paintings, and the way our house felt different now that we had stopped pretending to be people we weren't. He listened without offering advice or making demands, understanding somehow that I was not asking him to solve my life, but simply to witness it, to be present while I figured out what came next. On the drive home, I thought about the 18 years that had passed since that night in our dorm room, about all the choices I had made out of fear rather than love, about the careful architecture of respectability I had built around a life that had never quite fit. I thought about Clara discovering her colors again, about the children learning that families could take different shapes and still hold love, about the particular kind of courage required to stop running from yourself. That night, I sat at the small desk in the guest room and wrote another letter. But this one was different from the confession I had hidden in my drawer. This one was shorter, simpler, addressed to no one and everyone. A kind of prayer or promise to the part of myself I was finally learning to acknowledge. You asked how I would hold you, I wrote, my handwriting steadier than it had been in years. Like this. Always like this. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer, but not hidden this time, not buried beneath other documents. It sat on top, visible, a reminder of the question that had taken me 18 years to answer, a testament to the particular kind of love that had required a lifetime to understand. Outside my window, the street was quiet, the same street where I had lived for so many years, but that looked different now, as if I were seeing it clearly for the first time. The houses were the same, the streetlights still cast the same yellow circles on the pavement, but I was different, finally willing to inhabit my own life rather than simply observe it from a safe distance. I turned off the light and settled into sleep, thinking about tomorrow, about the slow and careful process of building a life that felt true, about the courage required not for grand gestures, but for small daily choices, for the decision to keep answering that question every day for as long as I was able. Like this. Always like this.